In this episode today, I'm back with Heitor looking at Lambda Power Tools. Heitor, great to have you.
Thank you for having me again.
And in the last recording, I was so excited that we directly jumped into what Power Tools is, but we did not hear anything about yourself. So, are you from Portugal, or your name kind of feels like that, is it?
No, close. I'm from Brazil originally. Heitor, it's a common name there, or kind of common name if you like. So I've been in AWS for it's gonna be 10 years actually, next month.
Wow, cool!
Yeah.
Congratulations. That's gonna be a big milestone.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's been kind of a crazy road. Like AWS, it changes very quickly. There's a lot going on all the time. So at the moment, I'm a what we call specialist solutions architect in a team called Developer Acceleration. What we do is we work with customers who are trying to modernize their application, maybe monolith to microservices, or they're trying to do event-driven architectures for the first time, or the likes of engineering processes, CI/CD, and the likes. That's kind of one of the interesting things about Power Tools because they're quite related. And another part of my job is to do Power Tools. So we kind of try to keep it real as we get close to customers so we don't get isolated in just doing the open source products without seeing how customers consume. And that's or dog fooding, I guess, would be the right word to use it, consume ourselves.
Yeah, that's great, and thanks for sharing that. So I don't know if you know, but I've lived in Argentina for 4 years as well.
Damn.
Speak Spanish. Do you still speak Portuguese?
I speak Portuguese at home for sure
Okay.
with my wife. For Python at the moment, we have two more maintainers, Ruben and Leandro. Leandro is Brazilian and Ruben is Portuguese, so we use Portuguese in our stand-up. But when I got the whole team, we got all kinds of nationalities. So we try to stay away and steer away from Portuguese, but we always joke, say the next offsite will be in Portuguese, so you better learn the language and such.
That's funny. Yeah. So that's what I do with the Mexican folks that we have in the team that I'm working with right now. I speak Spanish with them sometimes just to practice myself as well. And then
That's
we left
cool.
off yesterday with two questions, and I gave you some time to think about the answer. So
Yeah.
I asked, when is Power Tools for Go coming? And then a longer term question, when is Power Tools for Dart coming, right? If we ever get a Dart runtime. What do you fancy an answer for those?
Absolutely. Let's start with Dart because it's the easiest one to answer. So for Power Tools, there are a few things that we have to have before we consider a Power Tools SDK, if you like. One of them is, does it have an AWS SDK that's GA? Which is a similar discussion with Rust for quite some time. It's not necessarily GA as far as I remember. I could be wrong. And also, it has to have a Lambda runtime so we can support it. So if it doesn't have neither of those two, it's something we can't consider and shoot them. So Dart at the moment, no, not right now. Go, it's a different story. Go has a runtime, although it has a Go, most customers are recommended to use a provided runtime instead. It has a SDK that's GA. And the only thing that's missing, there's two things that are missing for us. One is more customers doing that thumbs up plus one, which we can add in the show notes. So we need to have more customers to know who are the companies asking, requesting it. If we were to do it, how much we could possibly move the needle. We have an email. People can share these things with us privately. You don't have to do this publicly if you don't feel comfortable to. And the other one is Go is the most difficult one for us, not from the developer experience wise, because we got an alpha actually working, thanks to Ruben, also maintainer in Python. But the challenge for Go is analytics or stats. As you can imagine, open source, it's great to have the community and everything else. But when you have this as a full-time job in a company doing commercial business, then you have to have measures of impact. Downloads or stars are somewhat okay, but you have to measure a lot more than that to basically get further investment. So for Power Tools, we want to make sure that if we're going to do a language, we're going to do it for real. So once we manage to get more additional customers, get to see some of those company names, and we find a way around some of the Google proxy or some of the limitations of Golang for analytics, then it's something we want to do. Tentatively, without don't Don't use my word for it. We should be reconsidering Go for next year.
Sounds very interesting. Um, I've been a lot on the Flutter side recently, which is why I asked the Dart question, right? But I know that there's some time to go until we go into that direction, so that's fine. Heitor, thank you so much. And with that introduction, let's now jump into what we wanted to talk about today, right? Which is essentially the continuous deployment, continuous delivery part for Power Tools. How would you frame that?
I think to make things easier, I would say continuous deployment. I always get confused. I used to remember this by heart, that one requires a manual approval and the other one is just basically automated hands-off deployments. So at the moment, we do have a manual approval because it's a high stakes in here, given our deployment and our reach. But let's call it continuous deployment for now. We can correct it later in the show notes if we like.
I'm trying to make those how to say those wordings as well a little bit clearer. So for me, continuous deployment means I push something to a branch and then it ends in a production environment. That does not mean that the feature that we just added in is kind of active directly. Continuous delivery would then to turn on that feature at the end. So that's the way that I differentiate that on my channel.
Cool.
The manual approval, I don't know, right? The manual approval at the end, you can have it in your deployment pipeline. You shouldn't, of course, from a best practice perspective. But if you do not have it, then you need feature flagging for all components of what you have. So then any new feature that you add or any defect, right, would need to be feature flagged. And I think that's something that is pretty difficult for a lot of organizations as well.
Yes,
I'm
indeed.
soon going to record with Ran Eisenberg a session around feature flags, and I know that you both love each other as well. So just teasing that out as well. So let's look into the continuous deployment part for Power Tools then, and I guess that you have something to share with us again, which makes it a little bit more visual. So let's move over that and let's share your screen. I can see your screen. There is one thing that I need to do on my side, so give me a second. And now we can get going, I would say.
Okay, awesome. So the previous episodes, for a quick summary, we looked into the CI part. Everything that happens should get code merged into our trunk or a developer branch. So this has no manual approval except going through a PR pull request process. So we looked into this. This means every feature is already into the trunk, has been tested. We know it works, but we haven't released to customers yet. Some customers could actually install a nightly build, if you like, going directly into GitHub. But this is not the released artifact yet. Let's look into the release part now, the CD.
Let's remind ourselves what we talked about. We talked about the release part, and we can jump over to the next slide, next view already. We talked about the release part being a combination of libraries that we're releasing, but also some Lambda layers that we're going to be looking at, right? So it's not kind of only an application; it's also a library that we're releasing, which is a little bit more difficult than releasing a full-blown application.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a bit hard to see. So what we're going to do is, so this is what we add in what we call a maintainer's playbook. So as you become a maintainer in Power Tools, there's a set of responsibilities that you should have. And we also keep it public. So we try to keep as our full transparency as our project aims to have. Because this is too big, this is big because we're trying to put everything in a single diagram. There's two diagrams I want to show you about the CD part. There's the actual time it takes on each of those or main steps, because trying to graph this in one place, even GitHub has issues to showcase the whole release. So instead, we're going to remove this continuous integration part and show my local Visual Studio code so we can have a proper conversation on it. So let me do this. Oops. So this should be a markdown. Made. I love this too. This is amazing. Here we go. So let me just remove the continuous integration and keep a single session. So you should have colors, I think. Yes, there we go.
Awesome, cool.
Yeah. So this is what is this? So when we are ready to make a release, before we go into our release notes, which is actually not here in this diagram, we do this every 2 weeks. Sometimes we do shorter, sometimes we do later if there's some other higher priority security operations wise. So once we go to GitHub and say we're good to go, we're gonna make a release and we're gonna bump the version or whatnot, then this process is pretty much all automated. All we have to do is to click a button, say release, and then until it gets to the release part, we simply wait until it pops up and asks another maintainer to review, and then all of us were always doing this live on a call to make sure there's no tampering, no other checks accidentally.
Okay, so just checking. This part of the process now kicks off on a defined time slot, not automatically, and it kicks off from the main branch, right? So, or does it always run on the main branch once you merge a PR?
So this doesn't run after you merge PR. This is a manually dispatch. So this is a manually triggered process. So if I were to visualize this now, so this is an actual release. So if I go back to release here, we have a workflow code release, which is quite big. And then you have this run workflow. And when we say, let's say we're going to launch 2020, for instance, when we go this and we click the run workflow, that entire process runs. We typically do this in a call with all the maintainers, and then we basically watch it go through, but make sure everything it's fine. As you can see, sometimes it fails for various reasons as we were implementing additional security measures.
Okay, I'm gonna ask one more question on this one now. If you click run workflow, and I can see that you have the branch develop here, right? You're creating a new branch out of the develop branch with the actual commit, or are you just tagging the actual commit? What happens behind that from the CD perspective?
Yeah, so we used to have multiple branches. So at the moment we only have one branch, develop, and that's it. Cool. Any other branch that's actually ever created is a temporary branch for creating a pull request. So we keep the develop branch protected. So nobody has access to make a push into this, but through pull requests. So the CI large process we saw yesterday goes through all of it. So no, we basically, when we go with run workflow, we essentially take the last commit as as soon as you click here, this is going to take as this is the release commit. Okay. And then we're going to keep this until the very last step in our process.
Cool. This is the information I wanted to hear.
Absolutely.
So it's a combination then of an automated process and also kind of a manual process, manually kicking that off, and then afterwards everything is automated, or is there something in between, like manual tests or manual approvals later in the flow?
We only have one manual approval. One practice we do in Powertools is, like we mentioned before in the previous episode, we are obsessed with documentation because we had issues in the past, not with the project, but in previous jobs and projects. So all of these pieces we're discussing today is already documented here. The only piece that's manual for us, let me zoom in a bit, is you're gonna, as a maintainer, you're gonna kick off this process. And then obviously there's gonna be a manual approval before we release. And you're gonna draft a release notes separately after this completes and publish. That's it. Cool. Everything else, this whole step we're gonna go through now in the video, it's automated.
Cool. Awesome. Then let's jump into it. So the manual approval is that first thing of starting that workflow at the end, right?
Yeah. Once we get to, let me see if I can find it here. Oh, it's because it's been quite a few days already. It doesn't show up. Let me go back to the diagram so we don't get confused.
Sorry for that.
No problem. So when we get to this release step, which we get in a minute, it's when we have a check that won't allow to get into the very first step of this job until it has been approved by someone that hasn't kicked this process. Otherwise, you kind of start the release and you approve yourself, which could be a security issue. So you always have to have 2 people here. All right, so I hit the button and this whole thing starts. The first thing we do before anything else is we do a process that's called seal. So sealing is essentially a process that we do to prevent any other part of this release process to change the source code. Because GitHub Actions, we run a job into a particular container. Every job in here is completely isolated from each other. But we don't necessarily block internet access because otherwise we lose the CI and GitHub Actions would fail. It's different from doing this and the way we do internally. So what we do is we check out the release code or the release commit as you hit that button. Now it's frozen. And we bump the release version so we don't have to do this process manually. So we basically, as the version, we bump into that. And we're going to freeze that source code. We're going to generate a tarball, all its permissions and such. And we generate an integrity check of everything that's been there. We upload this artifact, which is only available through the duration of this release process. And throughout every step, we essentially get this sealed code, untar or unzip, if you like, extract this release source code. We check the integrity check in case there was something tampered, which we don't know. And we continue with every step.
Okay, so this kind of ensures the integrity of the supply chain at the end, right? Of the deployment chain as well, so that no one can kind of put in anything into it that you don't want to have there, right? So that's, from a security perspective, very important. Got that?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I remind me later in case I forget. So we have additional anti-tampering checks throughout every step as well, but we don't actually visualize it here. Okay, so once we get this tempered, even though we trust our CI process, we have to verify. So the quality assurance step of our CD process not only restores the sealed code, it runs every check that you saw before on the previous video. So it goes through all the pre-commits, all the quality, security testing, and so forth. This doesn't do that, as you notice, it doesn't upload anything, because one of the issues that can happen in this phase in quality assurance for any release process is as you install development dependencies, maybe that development dependency could alter your source code. So we actually don't want any of that. So whatever it runs here, if it passes, we throw the container away. Then we start the build process. Same thing again, restore the sealed code. We do an integrity check now, because just in case someone accidentally added something, I don't know. We're obsessed with these things. So we build the release artifact. So in this case, it will be 2 binaries before we publish your respective registries, what we call PyPy in Python jargon. And we do the same process as we did the seal, but now we have to seal the build artifact. Almost like a golden image if you were to do Docker containers and such.
So this is at the end the stage when the immutable artifact that will then be shipped is created, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. One thing that's missing here, which we're going to be adding in the next few weeks, few weeks, because we got a lot of other stuff to do, is we're going to add additional step in here. Actually, additional phase before release, which is generating what we call provenance and attestation, which verifies that this build came from this GitHub, this commits, this org, and all these process inputs and such. Should add additional security. So we got to the release process, release phase, which the pipeline blocks now, and it has a timeout to verify that if another maintainer approves that this was in fact genuine and was as it's supposed to be. So that's why we do a call as well. It does everything else you would expect. And this is the piece that it's unique to Python compared to other languages, but I would love to hear other languages have it too. We don't have any secrets to publish.
Ooh.
So there's no GitHub secrets, nothing's hard-coded, it's all ephemeral. So what this does in Python is, Python has a feature called trusted, Oh, damn, I forgot the name now. It doesn't matter. I will figure it out later. What this does is the registry trusts GitHub because GitHub is also a OIDC provider, identity provider, if you like, and trusts the GitHub organization, the repository, the workflow name that we're making this release, in this case, release, and you also trust a particular environment where this job is completely protected and isolated from everything else, in addition to the container, if you like.
Okay.
So it's extra protection measure. If this workflow runs exactly the same inputs and parameters we have in a secret place, then it trades the JWT token from GitHub for a token to publish a release that will be valid only until this job lives.
Cool. So it's kind of an OIDC login that is being used by, let's translate that, by the IAM role of this container or this GitHub action execution at the end. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah,
and that's something
exactly.
Configured on the Python part side of it, right? So you needed to tell them this is the trustable workflow, and then it just works. That makes sense. Yeah, cool.
Yes, exactly. So once we get those credentials, then we can publish, and it does some verification that the integrity check again, all these things and such, which is inherent. And because these registries can take some time for it to be completely stored and verified, we add an additional baking time. So just to make sure that other steps won't fail because the release has some eventual consistency, if you like. Okay. So now that this is done, we have another concern now. If we already bumped the version as part of the release, the trunk is out of date. So we need to have a process to synchronize what's being successfully released to what the trunk is supposed to be meaning. But we cannot push to the branch from anywhere because it's protected. It would fail otherwise. It could cause security issues. So we have another process everywhere in this. All processes we have, in this case called git tagging. We do the same thing, get the C code, integrity check, we bump the git tag, but in order to change this at the git level in the trunk, we create a temporary branch with these changes now, and we create a pull request. So you're always going to receive these changes, so another maintainer could verify, in fact, this can now be merged into the trunk. So GitHub Actions don't have any permissions to push anything to our trunk. So our trunk is always protected.
Cool.
The next one is the hardest and the most complicated, but in this diagram it looks super easy. It's what we call the Lambda layers. So this is our second type of release artifact.
Let's hold for a second, because after that brown area, what I understand now, Lambda Power Tools library is now available for everyone to use the new version, right? So at the end, if you as a developer consume Power Tools as a library, just pip install Lambda Power Tools, blah, blah, blah. The moment after the gray area finished, I would be just able to do that, right? So I would just be able to use the new version. Everything that comes after this stage now is kind of convenience for others to use at the end, right? As far as I understood your descriptions. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So in Powertools, we have, besides the main language, this is your library you can install for your favorite dependency management tool in Python. We have an additional distribution mechanism specific for Lambda, so where we do additional optimizations to make this library faster at Lambda.
Wait, does that mean I can use Power Tools without Lambda?
Yes, we have customers using it in Fargate, in on-premises. We don't publicly give you a guide for this, but there are features that you can use indeed.
Cool. Okay. Sorry.
No problem. Okay, so now we start this Lambda layer. So we don't rely on the release commit anymore. We only need the artifact that was published at this release phase. So we fetch the release. That's why the baking time. And we compiled some of our dependencies into C, using Cython as a variant of Python. And we compile to both architectures that are available in Lambda, the x86 and the ARM in there as well. This is the longest part of our release. This used to take nearly 40 minutes because of ARM. It's a bit different, and GitHub doesn't natively support ARM, so we do some tricks to make it work. Thanks to Ruben. And once we're ready, we got this build now, similar to this, the build artifact. We now have a layer build, which we can now deploy in different environments. So this deploy beta, deploy prod you see everywhere is us launching a CDK, a CloudFormation stack on every region that we support this layer, and run this in parallel. So we're gonna have beta first. We have canary testing. Besides the CI checks that we do to make sure the library actually works, we don't necessarily know if the layer is actually going to work perfectly at the Lambda runtime. If something happens at Lambda runtime and it changes the underlying operating system, we want to be sure. So the canary testing gives us that confidence that we deploy to beta, and we create our own Lambda functions with multiple features, and we try to import what we just deployed in beta, and then we proceed.
So that canary testing is at the end a real end-to-end test of using Power Tools within the just deployed beta layers, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
That's awesome, and I would love to see how that actually is being done. But I can look at that later myself, right? Because this is something that I've been searching for a long time as well.
Sure. Luckily, everything is open source. It's so public and documented. So okay, so we do this this deployment of beta canary testing, like you just mentioned. Thanks, Alex, for doing some of this initial work as well. Also, a previous maintainer, and then we deploy to prod.
No, sorry. If something fails there, what happens?
If something fails here, the release stops. So one thing we had before, actually, let me go back in here. Say that the canary testing fails for any reasons. So every step in here, we can manually go back to only that step and onwards. So we can fix and have a separate one and go forward. So there's been many situations where a Lambda layer failed at canary testing, for instance, because there was an update in a new Python runtime, or you name it, and that changed something. So in this case, GitHub has the ability to just retry a particular piece. So let me show you here in Graphic so it makes more sense as we walk it through. So if you go to publish layer, you can see all this here, which is a lot.
That's a lot, yeah.
That's why it breaks when you show in GitHub Actions. Yeah. So if one of them fails, we need to see if this was a particular region, which happened. Maybe we got throttled because we go too fast, or maybe something else. It's more a systemic issue. So if it was just a flaky thing or throttling issue, we can simply retry this, and then everything else tries again. If it was something that we missed, or something happened at the Lambda runtime, or maybe it's, I don't know, something else, then we try to investigate, and we don't go forward with this release in this process, and we try to investigate that in isolation. If we fix, then we keep the release in failed state in this case, so we know how to audit it first, and then we go to every separate phase individually.
And then we would move forward like another PR and starting the release from scratch with a bumped version to fix anything that you found out throughout that process at the end.
We could do that. Yeah, we could do that. We could also have the option to say, just go from the layer only and just do this, or just do documentation. We have all of this automated. If I were to click...
Sure. Let's go back to the diagram, because now the other one, because now I'm confused. At the beginning, we said we have a sealed version of the source code, and I assume that this also includes the canary testing pieces, or not?
Not in this case, the Lambda layers, because we're going to fetch from the release that's now immutable. So we don't need to go back in here.
But the canary tests that you run, where are they stored, or where are they retrieved?
So the canary testing is always going to use this PyPy release that's being built in here. So we don't need to go back to the source code, because we are looking at what's being released immutably to our registry.
Then I maybe did not understand that piece, where that canary testing is a Lambda function somehow that is deployed through CDK.
Yes, and it uses the layer that we built in here in this process.
Okay. Good.
So it's almost as if we're doing a pip install or Maven install.
Okay, got it.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Makes sense.
Okay, no problem. So once this completes, then because we have this canary testing, we want to be sure that SAR, which is another distribution mechanism, is the same layer. The only difference is that when you deploy in your account a Lambda layer using semantic versioning, compared to layers that you just pass a Amazon resource name, the ARN, and then you can just use it. Once this canary testing works, we start the SAR deployment in parallel as well, so beta and prod. Once this is done, then we do the other pieces, which is documentation. One of the biggest challenges we had in the past is if I go to the documentation real quick, and you're going to notice one thing in the installation, which is we have the layer for x86, ARM, and a particular pip install, maybe even npm install. We have different regions, and the layers have this thing which is a bit difficult for us, which is the versioning doesn't have an alias or semantic versioning. So this keeps increasing in auto increment. So if I go to 218, you should see is a different version. And if you want to go to a particular region, we also have a table with all of them as well. And we have to make sure the release process takes into the account so we don't make the mistake of manually updating all this every release, which is burdensome. So this step, it should do exactly this. It updates all the Lambda layers now that we deployed, we verified, and so forth. With every region, every version, we build the entire documentation, the change logs, and everything. And we also create, like I mentioned, we create a pull request to update the trunk in case. And that's basically it. Everything else is just maintenance admin, so we can notify customers that, hey, your feature is now available. You can use in version X, and all those issues that have been tagged after their respective pull requests have been merged, all customers get notified now. That's basically the whole CD process. I'll stop here. There's a lot to digest, I'm sure. So I'll see if that makes sense.
It does. This is really awesome. It gives a lot of details. And as you mentioned, all of this is open source. So whoever is interested in more details around how do we deploy to 16 regions in parallel, right? That's something that people can see in the open source code as well. The same process is then also the same or similar for TypeScript and for other languages in Powertools, or is this a little bit different for the other languages?
Some of them are, most of them are different. So Python, because it is the biggest by, I can't even tell the number, but it's really, really big compared to other languages. Our repository is different, so much higher in that sense. And because until now, actually, Powertools was largely dependent on volunteers in some of the different teams inside AWS at this point. Despite all the quality we do, it's actually all volunteering basis, like in any open source project. Now that we have people full-time in Python for a year now, we're going to get the additional people now in full-time with leadership approval in other languages. So in this case, we're going to have the same level of governance everywhere. Some of the steps obviously will be different. For instance, this piece of cake, which I love now, it's not feasible in other languages. Java doesn't have it, npm doesn't have it. So it's something we have to use GitHub secrets in a slightly different way to make it more secure. But the layers process, the documentation, and the tagging, all of this would be the same.
And something that I would personally really want to see then going forward is that the workflows are shared between the different repositories, and also the custom actions that we would want to add would be kind of shared between the different languages where possible, right? And that's, I think, a problem that a lot of people also need to solve in their own organizations, right? When you need to support multiple languages, that's not always easy, right?
Yeah. Indeed. Luckily, so what we're doing is it's definitely not part of this conversation, but we could have, just think about GitHub Actions and everything. So one thing that we do everywhere is we have tons and tons of automation, as you already noticed. And we have this thing called reusable prefix. These are things that we can reuse in every language as well, and also across workflows. One of our jobs for the rest of the year is to, now that we have our own GitHub organization.
Yay.
We are going to, yeah, there's so many news, but I have to hold up for now before I don't want to spoil the fun. We will create a repository with our actions so it can be more easily maintained and shared across the different repositories. And there's been, I think, only a handful, not many, just a few really, asking, hey, some of those things you do, it's amazing. Can we just use it in our company? So now we're discussing, should we, besides creating our repositories for ourselves, should we get to the point that we can share some of these things? Like our end-to-end test is something that every customer that discovers how we do end-to-end tests, they want themselves. So maybe we do next year.
That sounds really, really good. Really, really good. And I love that idea of sharing those workflows and actions as well. I'm personally also looking into using more GitHub actions in the future. And I would, really benefit from also seeing that. So let's jump over again from sharing the screen to your to the main view, so we can just kind of do a short wrap up of what we learned. And can you stop sharing your screen? Sorry for that. There we are. Okay, cool. And I'm gonna ask one more question around where is this and why is this all stored in GitHub? Especially because I'm very biased towards using Code Catalyst, as you know, as you have maybe followed, and
Indeed.
I'm not sure, right? I know that Code Catalyst does not have an open source possibility yet, which is something that I personally would be inclined to get as well, right? So I cannot even share my own projects right now. But do you see a possibility to adapt, or a thought about adapting Code Catalyst for the Power Tools going forward, or not yet?
We haven't explored this option, if I'm honest. I think historically, even before Code Catalyst was even an idea, we were already on GitHub, and AWS specifically has a long history of having those projects on GitHub, from AWS to AWS Labs and samples and everything. So we stay close to where those customers want us to be there, and we meet them where they are in that case. At the moment, GitHub, it gives us what we need in terms of collaboration, meeting those customers, and the transparency that we need. In the future, if Code Catalyst gets to this stage where we have this parity, then it's something that we will be gladly reconsidering this point. But for the foreseeable future, no, we will be staying with GitHub, especially now that we just got our new organization.
Yeah, and that's awesome. So congratulations to that one. I think that's going to be really driving some more adoption and visibility as well for what you and the rest of the team have been doing. So thank you for everything that you do on the Power Tools, and also the rest of the team, right? Because I really believe that this is helpful for a lot of people.
Indeed, it takes a village.
Heitor, thank you so much. This has been awesome. Looking forward to do more together with you and meet you at re:Invent. Dinner's breakfast, 7 a.m. Saturday morning. At least I'm planning to arrive on Friday. So gonna see you there, and hopefully spend some time together.
Indeed. And thanks for having me one more time. And like I mentioned, everything is open source. Please have a look into all these things. If you have any questions, anyone watching later, please don't forget to join us on our Discord channel. Ask us questions. We're more than happy to help. We just got announcement last evening that we might have a new feature in the documentation to add blogs. So maybe we start blogging our engineering practices. We don't know.
That would be cool, because this is a great start for also helping others, right, to consume what you do.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. And
you too.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.